Okay, so we have the easy task of answering the question, what does the state of Asia mean for us and us as Europe, Switzerland, us here in the room. We have three super interesting panelists here, Simona, Sasha and Philipp. It's a great pleasure to have you for this discussion. And I'd like to start with a question, now that you saw that Indonesia is the country that was selected in the survey. What comes up in your mind when you hear that, Philipp?
Look at me, so I look a little bit Asian for former German Vice-Chancellor. So I was born in Vietnam, so I'm biased, of course, then adopted. So I think I would have Vietnam a little bit more on top, but it's fine. I tried to squeeze in, but it was too late at the end. And I think, by the way, it's really relevant. And the question was not what is relevant for us, but also relevant, and we don't know that much. And given that we have spoken the entire day about China, India, Indonesia, not that much about Vietnam yet. That's now my role to play. But yeah, so that came to my mind first.
Thank you so much. Simona, what about you?
The same question?
Does it surprise you, the result?
It does. Actually, it does, yeah. I don't know. I'm probably a bit biased in this regard. I would have thought that from all that we have heard and just the sheer size and magnitude, the answer would have been the most obvious one. But as I said, meaning China, maybe it's because I work in the Chinese Studies department, so I'm a bit, in my bubble.
I think we all are, yes. Yeah. Thank you. Sasha, what about you?
People are brutally honest that they know least of Indonesia. Yeah. Like, you can name probably 5 Chinese dishes, 5 Indian dishes, but like with Indonesia, except for nasi goreng, that's problematic. So if I know nothing about Indonesia, I know something about India and China, I read Indonesia in the top. I think that's the secret, but that's my theory.
But nothing against that Indonesian cuisine. It's very.
I'm a big fan, by the way.
Oh, good. Okay. So let me start with you, Simona. We're always saying at the Asia Society that Switzerland lacks Asia competence. At the same time, we talk about the rise of China all the time. We hear a lot about India. I think there's also been a development in the last few years. Is there still a lack of competence in Switzerland and in our societies about Asian development?
Well, yeah, I think the fact that we talk a lot about the fact that we need China competences doesn't really mean that we have them. I think the Asian Society does a great job. And as you said, in the past few years, also because of the visibility and events like the one that we are all taking part into, there is much more of a talk with international experts about key issues that also have an impact on us. But I do have to say, just comparing my past, I grew up in Italy and I studied Chinese in Venice, that has a long tradition in sinology. I have to say, I do believe that we have a manco in that regards in Switzerland. I'm half Swiss, because it's actually dawned on me that in '97, when I started studying Chinese, already we had an Asian study department there where you could choose different languages from Korean to, we also had several Southeastern Asian languages that you could pick from. And we already had different chairs in Chinese studies. In the University of Zurich so far, for example, we only have one chair for modern Chinese studies that focuses on literature. And I do believe that, it needs to be our China competences in Switzerland. We are a rich country, and I don't understand how come we cannot invest more by coupling the needed knowledge of the language, which is needed to decode important documents from the party, together with learning, for example, everything that comes with the millennial culture, to the history, and so on and so forth. So very briefly, yeah, I would say that we are really lagging behind in this in respect to Germany, but also in respect to Italy.
Interesting. Thank you so much. You, Philipp, you live in Switzerland as well, right?
Yeah.
So you can even compare Germany and Switzerland in that regard. Do we all lack Asia competence?
I would say no. For example, so when I was the minister at 13, we had a huge delegation. Back then, Li Keqiang was visiting from Beijing, Berlin. And afterwards, he was traveling to Bern, right? Because he was negotiating still the free trade agreement between Switzerland and China. Now you have it, whereas the European Union still has not even in mind to negotiate a free trade agreement with China. So this is one thing. The Air Society is in Switzerland, not in Germany.
No,
See?
not yet.
Yeah, see, so you're here, you can bring some information, some knowledge, some network, some people. So it's, maybe we should have soon a similar event in Berlin.
And you are also active in bilateral relations with Vietnam. Do you feel that there's a knowledge about Vietnam as a country here in Switzerland or in Germany, or no?
Unlike the recent poll, I would say yes, because one argument, you have a free trade agreement also with Indonesia since 2019, and still negotiating some with Vietnam. So I think it's sort of relevant, but not that much knowledge about it. But yeah, I came by accident to Vietnam. So I was born there, imagine, but then adopted to Germany as a little baby. So I don't speak any word Vietnamese. And again, inside German, outside Vietnamese. But they liked me. And then I started to understand, what their way of living is, their culture, and I fall in love. And then I said, look, I would like to support this country, very young society, 100 million people, average age 33, very technological oriented, hardworking. They are called the Swiss or the Prussians of ASEAN, which means a lot. And the relationship between mountains and flat land is almost similar to Switzerland. And look at you. So Zwind, the famous stuff here in Switzerland, was coded, programmed from a Swiss company, of course, but from Vietnamese programmer and software engineers. So that is a financial sector, Switzerland, Vietnamese are doing the job. Once they will come and buy UBS.
Wow, looking forward to that day.
Yeah.
Sasha, what about you? Do you feel that there's I mean, you live in Berlin now. You have the outside view of Europe from before. Now you live in Europe. How do you feel on that lack of competence on Asia? And has it changed in the last months and years, also with the war in Ukraine and so on?
I feel awkward commenting on the state of German China watching expertise, but I would say that expertise comes from investment into academic disciplines, attempts to marry academic scientific research to practice, and that's the job of think tanks, and a lot of practical engagement. So you see Jörg Wuttke and like the caliber of people that German industry can produce in their granular knowledge of China. And Jörg knows not only about the petrochemical industry in China, but a lot of things, right? And many German executives that I meet are also the same who work with China. I would say Germany has deep traditions of China watching academic research, and the difference between your departure from the government and now, 10 years later, is that they have institutions like MERICS. And I think that MERICS is really an institution that is defining the practical China watching field, policy oriented in European Union. And it's something which is
Could
impossible.
you tell us a bit more about MERICS?
That's
Maybe
a
not
Mercator
everyone.
Institute for China Studies, an attempt where Mercator Stiftung came and gave a chunk of money to create really a practically oriented, like policy-oriented institution that does applied research. Bunch of German large companies have thrown tiny little pennies into that money pot, and the German government came in. And as a result, over the last 10 years, they have just celebrated their anniversary. They created really an institution that's visible not only in Europe, but also globally. So it's terrific to have Asia Society here, but I think that friendly competition cooperation creates miracles. So once you are on this bike, you need to pedal hard, because I think that as much as chances and opportunities will come from Asia in terms of economic growth, so come multiple risks, be it geopolitical risks, be it kind of crunches for supply chain. COVID was one example. Mounting military risk in various parts of Asia is another one. And then competition. We spent a good deal of time talking about Chinese electric vehicles. And I think just that one example where there will be multiple challenges that will threaten the very way of life here. And I think that just being, clear-eyed about them is a necessity.
We woke up in a world which is much more belligerent than a few years ago, and we sometimes had the feeling that Europe was not prepared for that. Can we say that at least it strengthens our knowledge about the world, because we have to care? We don't have the option anymore of just looking from the outside. Maybe Simona, you are often commenting on a potential war on Taiwan. I mean, obviously, a few years ago, nobody would have known even where the country is, and now, I mean, the competence is much more there. Would you agree?
I don't know if there's a lot of competence. Otherwise, as you said, probably we would have, and I would actually, be happy about it. But I would have more competition in talking about Taiwan. So the fact that we talk about it more is probably more because, as you said, the risk has increased. By the way, I don't think that the war is the most likely scenario. If anything at all, I would think it would be a blockade. But at any rate, I believe that, going back to your question, the fact that we talk more about Taiwan is actually related to a simple fact, and this is the so-called internationalization of the Taiwan issue. Barely a few years ago, as you said, many people even mistook Taiwan with Thailand. Now we all know, of course, what Taiwan is, where it is located, what are the issues. So in that sense, of course, you're right. The general level of knowledge and competence in and around Taiwan has grown, as has the interest, because of the potential repercussion it has on us. I mean, we have not talked about it, but relating to the talk that you gave this morning, Philipp, when you said that, in reality, it's about interest. We should pursue our interest rather than value-based approach. We often hear the value aspect in connection with Taiwan because Taiwan is a fellow democracy. But even if we don't care, and I think we should, but even if we don't care about the fact that we should, try to be protective of the current system, and that also means protecting, of course, a country that, is a democratic, law-abiding country, we have interest at place, and that's why we all talk more about Taiwan. The fact that, if anything, the Rhodium Group calculated it last year in December 2022, would happen, and not even a war, but just a blockade, that would mean, I think, $2.5 trillion, right, of kind of like economic losses for the world. We know that Taiwan is at the center stage for the production of semiconductor. 92% of the most advanced one comes from Taiwan, and 60% of the global output of the bigger one in nanometers. So there are a lot of course, interest that we have in Asia, in Taiwan, and in China. And I agree with you. The fact that we talk about it more really does help in spreading knowledge. But as Sasha said, I think that the more granular issues going beyond what we can say in a half-a-page interview in the media does not come from these kind of things, but it comes really from more investment, more competition, more positions. So I totally agree with you on that.
Sasha, would you agree? Because now you are also working, obviously, on the conflict between Ukraine and Russia. And the West got Russia very wrong in not believing it would invade Ukraine. Do you think that now we woke up, now we know better? Would that change our attitude towards China?
I think that war in Ukraine is a big wake-up call in terms of all possible scenarios that involves geopolitical risk around the world, particularly in Asia, particularly around Taiwan, but not only that. I think that it's very easy to work backwards from February 24, the way some countries in the European Union do. And like, if you remember the old series, like, do the I told you so dance, right? Like, oh, we told you so. Like, the moment that Putin has put his bloody hand on the constitution in 2000, May 6th, he was repeating like February 24, 2022. That's the day I'm going to go and invade Ukraine, like, not to forget. And it's easy, again, to work from fait accompli backwards and say Russia has been always the same. That denies you agency to shape your own course, and that denies the various factors in play that shape our decisions. Like, the way you are today with partner you have or whatever was not predestined. It's all the time various choices that you make. And I think that since Ukraine and geopolitics is a little bit out of headlines, people might think that, okay, this was a very special situation. Now we go back to our kind of dormant, quiet life. We have a lot of other problems. And this kind of scenarios lose their urgency. And once again, when they pop up, you come unprepared. That's something similar to what happened in 2014 and 2022, right? So the writing was on the wall that doing more energy infrastructure with Russia is kind of made sense probably before that. Like, Nord Stream 1 seemed to be a reasonable project. Nord Stream 2, questionable. So I think that we as humans just are tired to look into catastrophic scenarios and want to ignore them. I think that's unfortunately not the time in human history that we have the luxury to ignore them. So better be safe than sorry. I think that's a very nice organizing principle for the Americans, and the more it's adopted in Europe, I think the better.
Thank you. Philipp, you have talked about most countries in the world being more transactional than European countries, as maybe that even Europe could be like the only place on earth which cares so much about values, which makes it super hard to agree on certain things in geopolitics if all the other regions in the world are only transactional and we're not. Do you agree, or what can we do in that situation?
Now, first, it should not be misunderstood that we certainly are in favor of values and that we are proud that we do have values, and from our point of view, the right values. However, first, that does not mean that we have to push our values over to other societies with a different historic and societal background. This is the first thing. Second, we have to be honest to ourselves as well. It's nice to have the values, but this cannot be the leading topic when it comes to foreign policies. Because we have an interest, and we should have an interest, benefiting our region, our countries, whatever. And so we have to define it, and sometimes we have to make a trade-off between following the interest, again, in the interest of your country, or to really have the idealistic values and take it like a nice flag in front of you. And this is one thing, and the other thing is others try to push us into this, to manipulate us. They say, look, but you have the values, and if you have the values of democracy, you cannot work with China. That's what we quite often hear. But at the same time, the same countries who are saying this recently signed last time I will mention Vietnam, a comprehensive strategic partnership with Vietnam, which has exactly the same political system as China has, for example, Central Committee, Politburo, Standing Committee, and so on. So that means if you are not in favor of this country because of its democratic system, how reliable are you if you then sign with another country a nice partnership, even though it has the same political system? So, and we are the only one who's saying, oh, yeah, they are not democratic, so we don't speak with them, we should not trade with them, and we should be very suspicious and cautious to have any relationship with them. And this is how we get manipulated, because we are idealistic and we love it to be it, but it's not the real world.
Do you agree, Simona?
You're asking me? Yeah, I mean, to a certain extent, of course, I think that the two things go together. It wouldn't be the first time that politicians sugarcoat their arguments in a way that, it's more about realpolitik or interest, but to sell it, and these American politicians are a very good example of that, to sell it to the people, of course, you sugarcoat it in more liberal arguments, democracies versus autocracy. So I don't necessarily disagree with you, but if we take the case of Taiwan, I think these two things go hand in hand because of the reasons that I mentioned before. The fact that the Taiwanese government, of course, wants to make a case that in order to entice other European and other Western democracies to support it, that we share common values, that we share a similar system, hence we should support Taiwan. But of course we all know that if we choose to support Taiwan, if one day something happens, implement sanctions, it's also because we have our own really practical interest in actually supporting the situation to remain stable. As I said before, the semiconductor industry, for example. So yes, I agree with him.
Sasha?
Partially.
I think that it's a needle that needs to be treated very carefully in terms of the signals that you send to both sides in support, if we are talking to Taiwan. Because the dynamics between human is this, that she said, he said, and there's a symmetry of information. We don't know what the other person thinks. So the way to communicate to the Chinese why Europe is doing certain actions with regard to Taiwan, probably in private, without kind of grandstanding or making a big moral theater about that, but explaining very down-to-earth way, if not in public channels, then definitely in private channels, where the interests are, what the long-term goals are. It's that not that we don't want to kind of boost Taiwanese independence or whatever. We clearly understand where your red lines are and we want to talk about them. But like it's something where we want to see common ground based out of narrow, egoistic, national interests. I think that's something where, again, investment into expertise on how to structure this conversation could be really helpful.
Yeah, just briefly interject
please.
just very briefly. I totally agree with you. I think there are much better ways to support Taiwan if we choose to do so than what we have seen often portrayed in the media as, you know, support of Taiwan by going there, for example, parliamentary delegations. I mean, they very often, I'm not saying necessarily this is bad. They happened before in time as well, but the situation with China was different. So the tensions were different. Now they provoke a different reactions, like a blockade as such as it happened in August 22 when Nancy Pelosi went there. So I agree with you. The granularity, as you called it before, comes with knowledge that, in my opinion, we probably could do more behind the scenes kind of support to allow, for example, participation of Taiwan, not in international organizations that would also, of course, irk China, but as an observer in all these organizations that don't require statehood for a membership, right? And that would probably also find a way to integrate it better in terms of trade, rather than just have these ego acts that serve more the parliamentarians that go to Taiwan than anyone else, as well as Taiwan.
Sasha, and then Philipp, yes?
I think that to flip this discussion a little bit, there is also a risk emerging from the other side, misunderstanding how Europe works. Like, I witnessed that in Russia a lot. Like, Russians claim to be Europeans, and they are culturally, maybe. But the misunderstanding of how Europe functions in the very senior layers in the Kremlin and the Russian government is staggering. People don't understand very basic concept of how European Union functions or German political system. And because of these misperceptions, they make terrible mistakes. Explaining to people that, look, politicians do take selfies nowadays, it doesn't mean that there is a strategy behind it and that strategy is threatening and we are happy to sit down and talk to you. I think that's one of the major risks we're running with China, because China, like, we think that we don't understand China, which is fair, and we need to make a lot of effort to understand it better. Does China understand the West well? I don't think so, and I think that with cuts of ties and like people-to-people exchanges, a lot of platforms that used to have Chinese scholars in the room now exclude them because we want to have our own conversation. I think that also creates increasing room for misperceptions, misunderstandings that feeding into their channel of command, and ultimately may force Xi Jinping to make a lot of very grave mistakes that will have consequences for all of us.
Thank you. Philipp, you wanted to?
Again, so I'm not anymore a politician, but I still remember how they're working, right? So, and if they are super desperate at home because of domestic policies, quite often they love to go to Taiwan. It's in the US as well as in Europe or Germany the case. They get nice articles at home, but I think it's at least allowed to raise the question if they really have achieved something for the good for the people on the ground in Taiwan, yes or no. Some in Taiwan say that always after one of these trips, the situation is becoming even more worse at home rather than better. Because what is helpful for Taiwan if we have a nice article in Berlin, right? So this is at least allowed to question this. Second, you mentioned the semiconductor issue. What will happen, assume 1 second, dream 1 second, the capability will be back in the US, or dream 1 second, even in Europe, and then something will happen in Taiwan. How engaged will be the world community then if they have only the democracy and the, I think it sounds weird, but the human rights topic? Would they be engaged there, start with sanctions, even send troops? I'm not that sure. And because politicians have the job to have the right opinion. And if you are in the business or a doctor, whatever, then you have to do the right thing. And currently, I have not the feeling that they are doing the right thing, but rather than have the right opinion or looking good because of the current trend of value-based foreign policy, at least in some regions of the world.
Thank you. So let's take it back to Switzerland. In the last round, I would like to ask you if there's still a place for a neutral Switzerland. Can it help the world to be a better place? And I would like to start with you.
Who am I that I'm hosted here since 10 years. Very warm welcome. I was welcomed, and then to give advice to Switzerland, but I'm not that sure if they ever have been really neutral and impartial. They have been, of course, bloc-free. But if you do see the relationship, even on a military basis, they have been always oriented towards the Western world. By the way, unlike India, for example. So they always, make sure that the weapons are coming from Soviet Union back then and the US or the NATO, and this was different here. But I think Switzerland, again, humble advice, so they should think through if this model will still work out, because we have seen that recently Wang Yi has invited the Arabian leaders and foreign minister colleagues to Beijing. They have not met in Geneva, right? So, and I think they should give us a signal. So, and I've seen how Switzerland was struggling when Russia attacked Ukraine. So I think they have to invent these kind of impartial, neutral for 2023 and following years again.
Thank you, Simona.
Right. I mean, I also feel a bit uncomfortable since I didn't grow up here, but I will say this. I mean, neutrality, I believe, is many things. I'm not expert on the legal side, which also is very important in the case of neutrality, but in case of foreign policy, I believe it's been a very useful tool for Switzerland to navigate very choppy moments, and it will continue to be a very useful tool. I think that even with the neutrality policy, that has not stopped the Swiss government from being able to actually recognize victim from aggressor when it came, for example, to imposing the sanctions after Russia invaded Ukraine. And I think that just like with this case, we will continue to probably see the neutrality policy with some adaptations according to what happens. But clearly, one thing we need to keep in mind is that the case of Russia was a little bit easier than if anything would happen between China and Taiwan, because of the sheer magnitude of the business and trade relations that, of course, also because of the free trade agreement Switzerland has with China rather vis-a-vis Russia, right? And so I think it will be a much more complicated issue, and I think that's why the government is also approaching it and talking about what to do in case this kind of scenario would likely kick in, and I will leave it at that.
Thank you, Sasha.
I'm feeling in an even worse position, but here are my two very quick points. We're living in an age of identity politics globally, but in the West in particular. So neutrality based on cold-blooded calculation of your interests that work for Switzerland for centuries doesn't necessarily fly well with the younger population and with Switzerland's neighbors in particular. People don't relate, like how don't you take a stance in something that's all the time very clear-cut moral dilemma for many people, even if it's not a very clear-cut moral dilemma. So I think it's hard. And as generation of politicians will change, that will be increasingly a challenge on how to operationalize that. The other part is the very backbone of this economy, which is part of that, at least, is the financial sector. At the time when sanctions are a weapon of choice and financial sanctions become increasingly in the toolkit of any major power. The US has it, China has developed its own financial sanctions, Russia is busy trying to do with whatever like limited resources it has in the global economy to weaponize its financial system as well. And I think that it's very difficult to stay neutral because you will increasingly be blamed for providing a safe haven for some bad guys awaiting sanctions. And I think that's a challenge that Swiss policymakers will have to navigate or think through, because we're going to have more of that sort of behavior internationally going forward, unfortunately.
Thank you so much, Sasha, Simona, and Philipp, for this interesting discussion. Thanks.